All right, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. Just some things. There's food in the back if you all haven't gotten some. Also, if you all didn't know, we're raffling off books, copies of the books at the end of the event. If you didn't fill out a sheet of paper with your name and email, make sure that you do so at the back. So we would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the traditional territories of the Three Fires peoples, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must keep in mind the ongoing effects of colonization, community struggle for self-determination, colonial state violence, and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. I would now like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Bill Lopez is an assistant clinical professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and faculty director of public scholarship at the National Center for Institutional Diversity. Professor Lopez received his master's degree in public health from the University of Texas Health Science Center and his PhD in public health from the University of Michigan. His work focuses on the impact of immigration enforcement on mixed status Latinx communities. Today, he will be speaking about his book, Separated, where he examines the lasting damage done by a day-long act of collaborative immigration enforcement in Washtenaw County, Michigan. Please help us in welcoming Dr. Bill Lopez.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll use it. I'm going to use it. Okay, great. Sounds right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here. Very happy to see so many folks, both from the School of Social Work and also so many folks from public health. Does the mic sound right? Lauren, can you hear it? Is it echoing? I think. Let me see. Better, better. Let me try that, and if not, we can switch to the handheld one. Sounds a little bit better, less echo. I think there's still, let me switch to the other one. Okay, good afternoon. Very good to be here. Happy to see everybody. And great to see so many folks from public health. Hi, joining us on the other side of campus. Yep, great to see you. So today I'm going to talk to you about my book, Separated, Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid. But rather than just read parts of the book, which I will do, I also want to kind of engage in a conversation and think about how we can think about and discuss immigration enforcement and other aspects of state violence, right? So what does immigration enforcement do to individuals, families, and communities? And how can we understand our work in relation to that? I definitely don't have to say this in the School of Social Work because I know you all know, but often this work can be exhausting. It's challenging for many of us. It reminds us of traumas that we've had in our own lives, and it takes a lot out of us to do it. So what I always find myself doing is thinking about how we can continue this work, right? What does it look like to make sure we're planting the seeds for the next generation to continue doing that? So I invited the students that are currently working with me in my lab to do this work, just to share some reflections of what they thought about doing it. And so what I'll talk about here focuses on a home immigration raid. And this raid took place about 9 miles from where you are right now. So I want to be clear, like this is your own backyard. This is our backyard, right? Our work currently is focusing on immigration work raids. So these are raids that are a totally different scale where we see 100 people, 120, 200 people removed from these cities. We've been interviewing folks who have responded to these raids that have since started back up again since 2018. So I invited my students to share some of their reflections on that for a couple minutes. Who wants to go first?
Hi, everybody. My name's Madeline. I just want to share a little bit about my experience working with Dr. Lopez and his research team. Um, I began doing my research with them over the summer on his project about health implications from large-scale immigration raids. And before joining, I'll be honest, I didn't know the extent of the issue that's happening in our country right now. I'd heard about deportations and ICE raids on the news, but what I didn't know was how militarized they are when ICE raids a workplace, the helicopters that swarm from above, the bulletproof vests and guns that come in to round up innocent people. I didn't know about how they knock down doors to households, traumatize children, and the effect of separating families on mental health, just health in general, and generations to come as well. It's often really difficult to listen to the stories of people that we've interviewed, but it makes it very real. And it's also crazy that this is happening right, as Dr. Lopez said, in our own backyard. The proximity of this is a little crazy. I used to think this was more of a border issue, but it's happening right here in Ann Arbor. A lot of our work is, well, mainly in Midwestern states. So yeah, that was crazy too. So I just want to thank Dr. Lopez for writing a book and bringing awareness to this issue. I believe there's hope in bringing on some positive change in the system that we're in right now by bringing awareness about what's happening, and hopefully we can keep families together. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aisa, and I'm a sophomore here. And I just started in this lab this August, and I'm just going to share like a short reflection I wrote at a worksite raid that we went to visit in Ohio. May all who enter as guests leave as friends. When I saw this quote on a wall at a local diner in Sandusky, Ohio, I was taken aback by how far from the truth this statement really was. A couple miles down, on June 5th, at a small nursery named Corso's Flower and Garden Center, a worksite immigration raid occurred that led to 114 undocumented workers detained. My lab and I went to visit the site where this raid occurred. As I walked into the entrance of Corso's, I was met with flashing red signs of believe, peace, and joy. I continued to walk through the store and saw a blanket that said, having somewhere to go is home. Having someone to love is family. Having both is a blessing. I was infuriated at the irony of these objects and sayings because right next door by the greenhouses is where this raid happened. A raid that left so many families shattered and kids being home to an empty house. All I could see in my head were ICE agents, assault rifles, guns, dogs, helicopters, and workers being zip-tied before they were led onto ICE buses. All I could hear in my head were parents sobbing over the phone or texting someone, "Te encargo mis hijos, I entrust my kids to you." How can I be at peace and full of joy believing in a country that separates people from their families? I do not believe in this. However, I do believe in a Latinx community that is powerful and resilient because we will fight back. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lopez Cervantes. I am a first-year HMP graduate student at the School of Public Health. I joined the team pretty late, and I want to give a thanks to Bill for taking me in. When I met him, I had already heard so much about him and the work he was doing, and it hit really close to home, especially because I come from an undocumented community, so I feel like being here in this space makes me feel like I'm making a difference back at home. So thank you for giving me that piece. So I wrote a short poem. It's called Humans, or more so a short piece. Latinx blood runs through my veins. Over time, the seeds planted by our ancestors grew into roots, which grew into a generation unyielding in the midst of a political earthquake. From the beginning of time, we were born into a world full of systemic injustices, racism, and the cruelty of people who believe that we are less than. Through this, we learn to garner the shield of resilience passed on by our ancestors who told us we were destined to succeed. There was no other way. However, I'm here to say we are worthy of respect, worthy of resources, and worthy of stay, not because of our bountiful successes, but because we are human. Humans whose hands pick the food you eat. Humans who pay their taxes and dues. Humans who support their families and others. Humans who share the same hopes and dreams. Live in the flesh, humans. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. One of the things we try to always remember that this book and our work focuses on these specific moments of particular darkness in our community, right? We're looking at something traumatic, but our community is about so much more than this. We use this perhaps as a vessel to tell the story about, as you said, systemic injustice, but we never forget about the resiliency. What we're celebrating every day by joining together and looking far beyond the traumas we experience. So just to give you an idea of how this is going to go, I'll read pieces of the book and kind of tell the overarching narrative of what's going on, and then I'll take some questions just to have a little bit more of a discussion. Before I start reading, I just like to give a background of the study and what was going on and where the book came from. I walk around a lot, I stand a lot, I'm going to sit down too, so sorry to the camera people who are filming this. So when I was doing my dissertation, like in the intro said, at the University of Michigan, I was volunteering with the Washtenaw Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Rights, or WICR, who operates an urgent response line here in Washtenaw County. And while I was doing that, I found out about this pretty big immigration raid, or at least big by the standards of our county, in which police and ICE were involved in this day-long act of immigration enforcement, right? So started in the morning with arrests. There were folks arrested all day long who drove out of this taller, or this automobile shop. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, there was this raid in which the SWAT team and ICE raided the apartment on top of the taller. At the same time, the School of Public Health was collaborating with other organizations and doing a survey called the Encuesta Buenos Vecinos. And that survey was 5 months of data on the Latino community in our county. And so the raid just happened to hit in the middle of that, right? So we see from kind of this research quantitative perspective, we have a before and an after with this, quote unquote intervention, that we can actually see what happens quantitatively to the health of folks. So part of the work ended up being quantitative, what health changes before and after an events like this. But the book was drawn from the qualitative components of the work. And to get a little method-y on you, the qualitative component included field work and 3 subsamples. I say this because my MPH students are here, so I can get them thinking about the work they're going to do in the future. 3 subsamples to the qualitative sample, right? So the first was folks who were directly impacted by the raid. So that was people who were in the apartment or in the taller or pulled over and directly came face to face with officers. The second was their family and friends, or rather their immediate family. And then the third was representatives of organizations who served them. So altogether, the goal was to get a sense of how the impacts of this event rippled outward. But it's hard to know. You have all kinds of questions when doing this work, and you learn as you go, right? So now I speak about it based on all of these conclusions I've came to from doing the work, but throughout the process, I was learning the entire time. I was ready to go. I was ready to get on the plane, fly to Mexico, take a bus to his small pueblo on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and interview Santiago face to face, cara a cara. It would be the perfect culmination for the final chapter of a book that I would write about Santiago's arrest, detention, deportation, and return to the very poverty and danger he had attempted to flee with his family in the first place. I envisioned myself sitting across from him, sharing a cup of coffee as we both lamented the violence of the deportation machine that rips from their day-to-day lives, rips men from their day-to-day lives, and thrusts them back across the border. The peaceful image of a friendly host welcoming me into his home would contrast strongly with the villain that Immigration and Customs Enforcement was so determined to arrest and deport that it leveraged a county SWAT team with their bulletproof vests and automatic weapons to kick in his door and gather evidence of the illegal drugs he was accused of selling. But I never took that red-eye flight to Mexico. I didn't ride a bus from Mexico City to a small town off the map, hike the hills to a tiny house with a dirt floor, and have coffee poured for me as I sat across from Santiago. Instead, I went to a Dunkin' Donuts. In a small, everyday Midwestern town in southeast Michigan, I picked up 2 coffees and 15 donut holes and went to visit Santiago's sister, Guadalupe, a Mexican woman with dark black hair and glasses who was 26 years old at the time of the raid. Guadalupe and I ate in her tiny kitchen as a younger daughter, Fatima, ran around us, occasionally stopping for her mother to wipe her mocoy nose from a cold that she just couldn't shake. Guadalupe shares with me that Fatima's cold was just one of many. Her 3 children's health had all deteriorated after the raid, and she wasn't sure whether their illnesses were the result of the gas that had been echado into the room as it was raided, the frio of the November air that enveloped Fatima's 2-month-old skin after agents had kicked in the door, or the pavor of military-grade assault weapons pointed at their heads. But Guadalupe confesses that the children's erratic health and changing behaviors complicated the near impossibility of finding jobs in childcare in the absence of Santiago, who was also her economic provider. When Guadalupe and I finish talking, she plugs her cell phone into the speaker system. She dials in a calling card number she has memorized, and she calls a small town in Mexico that I will never visit. And Santiago talks openly to me about the raid and his deportation. When he's done, he passes the phone to his wife, Fernanda. Fernanda was 22 years old when Santiago was arrested. She lived with Guadalupe in the apartment above the taller with her 2 kids, 3-month-old Ignacio and a 1.5-year-old Lina. Fernanda, depressed, suicidal, broke, and with kids whose health similarly fell apart, took a bus from Michigan to Texas and walked across the border to Mexico to be with her deported husband. So not going to Mexico forced me to think deeply about a vastly different side of immigration violence. I was made to reckon with an aspect of immigration law enforcement too often overlooked. Those left behind, who are not the target of immigration enforcement actions, who may not even be undocumented themselves, must nonetheless deal with a deportation machine that is militarized, traumatic, gendered, and profoundly violent. I reflect on this a lot, that my original focus was to think about the man who was removed. And I don't think this is far from what we do on a national level about think of deportation, about the people who are plucked out and removed. And I say men because statistically it is more likely to be men. But when I wasn't able to go visit Santiago, instead I went to see his sister, who was taking care of her sick children, who was trying to get a job, who now has to drive, whose life was slowly unraveling from this long-term violence in a way that I had missed when focusing on this acute violence of removal. I think it's also important to talk about, so my focus clearly shifted at that point to the families of those left behind. One important point to reflect on when doing this kind of work, we gather our data in qualitative work and in field work by talking to people, right? But we're generally only allowed to or welcomed to, or however you phrase it, talk to certain groups of people. We know a lot of times this falls along gender lines, right? So particular people are allowed in particular places. It can also fall along age lines, so you are with people of the same age group. Many different ways in which the work we do is facilitated by the network we have, often by people with whom we associate in specific ways. So part of what also shifted my focus is that at the time I was raising 2 kids about the same age as many of the people who are also raising kids in this community. So that's what ended up happening, is that no matter who you can and can't associate with as people, once your kids start playing, many of those dynamics kind of disappear, right? So when my kids were hitting a piñata with other kids, when we were all in the same car together, our relationship shifted. My relationship shifted, and the focus of the folks that I spoke to was, how do we keep our families together? How do we raise our kids amid this threat of immigration enforcement? So I started to talk about this in a very different way. Rather than how deportation impacts individuals, and specifically men, how deportation and immigration enforcement more broadly impacts individuals, families, and communities. And I started to build on this idea of mixed status families. And this idea is in the literature a little bit more, but I think everyone from these communities kind of intuitively knows that life is different within families for people of different immigration statuses, right? So mixed status family, meaning a family in which individuals in that family have different statuses, usually an undocumented parent and citizen children. So naturally, I would say a community composed of mixed status families is a mixed status community, right? And in the same way that in a family, even if everybody is citizens except that one individual, if one individual is removed, that family is impacted. I would say in a community, even if the majority are citizens, if some of our friends and neighbors are undocumented and those families start fragmenting, that will affect the whole community. So I think it's often intuitive to think about, actually, I'll back up a little bit. So like I said, this focused on a day-long act of immigration enforcement that kind of culminated in the raiding of this apartment. And what I did was take the interviews and the descriptions of what it was like to be in that apartment and put them together in 3 distinct pieces in the book. So it reads like it's third person present tense. So it's read like a story is going on. And I want to read part of that description to you, because I think it's important to know what an immigration raid is like for those folks who were in the building at the time. And you'll hear me come back to many of the same people in the story. So Guadalupe parks the car at the taller and climbs the stairs to her apartment, her daughter Sofia clinging tightly to her mother's body. She sits down with her sister-in-law Fernanda. With Guadalupe and Fernanda sit their 4 U.S. citizen children. As they speak, SWAT team gathers outside the door. As Guadalupe remembers it, I was talking with my sister-in-law. That's when the soldiers arrived. Open the door, agents yell from the outside. Then, taking advantage of their no-knock warrant, an agent kicks in the door, breaks the lock, and the agents rush inside. Guadalupe says the soldiers came in the house, they knocked down doors, they threw gas, they had guns. We were 2 women with small children. My nephew was 18 years old. Yes, it was absolutely terrible, to be honest. The kids terrified, the kids screaming, and well, from then they started handcuffing. We were ordered to the carpet, to the carpet. And from there, immigration agents came in. So many groups of people arrived, and since my nephew was a man, they handcuffed him and took him. Immediately on the other side of the door stood Fernanda, who was holding her 3-month-old son in her arms. Fernanda says, yes, they hit me with the door they broke. So what I didn't drop the 3-month-old baby boy that I had in my arms. And Guadalupe, they already had her behind me. They were pointing guns at her. They pushed me, and I fell over all the toys. Then that is where they had me, pointing their weapons at me, at Guadalupe, and at an American woman who was also underage. Fernanda's fall, either after being hit by the door or after tripping over her children's toys, may partially account for the bruises on her body she presented at a community meeting held the following Sunday I attended. Fatima is lying in the cradle as the agents enter the room, and Guadalupe recalls, I threw myself on the rug with the baby girl, and I remember I was filled with coraje because my other daughter was in a cradle, and the agent told me to take her out. And when I took her out, one of the soldiers threw it. An ICE agent looks at Fernanda and Guadalupe. You have to speak English, he says. If you are here, you have to speak English. What is your name? Because I'm going to look for you later. I'm going to look for you and take your kids. Another agent tries to refocus his attention on the purpose of the raid. Stop, stop. We are not here for the women. We are here for Santiago. Guadalupe recalls that there are 6 agents in the room at this time, 2 with ICE on their helmets and vests. The ICE agents are white, as far as she can tell, and all 6 are men. Agents round everyone up and sit them in the living room. One agent tries to talk to Guadalupe in Spanish. No tengan miedo, don't be scared. Solo venimos por una persona, we just came for one person. Encontramos más, es mi trabajo llevarlo. We found more, and it's just my job to take them. Ustedes pueden quedar aquí, nosotros nos vamos. You can just stay here. We're leaving, we're on our way out. The door is broken, and the breeze is blowing. While the agents are warmed by adrenaline and body armor, Guadalupe is worried about her children. They told us to go to the living room, she says. They put us all together, but like I told you, the door was open, the cold wind was coming in, and our kids didn't have any jackets. And my baby was just a month and a half. Jessica, a 16-year-old white US citizen who was dating Santiaguito at the time, recalls the moment the SWAT team arrives in the same way that almost everyone else did, an abrupt entrance punctuated dramatically by firearms. Jessica says, we were all upstairs, so they kicked in the front door and they climbed up the stairs on the side. They held guns to everybody's head and just ordered all of us. We had to get out of the room because we were all in the room sitting down. I was changing the baby, and we all had to go in and sit on the couch that was in the living room. They were all just yelling at them like, if you are here, you need to speak English. Why are you going to come here if you aren't going to speak this fucking language and stuff like that? From a restaurant across the street, 3 urgent responders, Elena Maria, Amalia, and Ofelia, watch as cars pile up outside the taller. You know what? I'm going to go see what's going on, Elena Maria says. Nervously, the 3 women walk toward the police activity and begin to take notes. What's in the apartment? Ofelia notes that Guadalupe, Fernanda, and their children are scattered and distracted. Ofelia says you could tell that they were just really charged by what happened and their experience. And one of the toddlers, the older one, she must have been like 2 or so. She was walking around kind of like with this shocked face on her. And her sister was like hitting her with her doll, and she wasn't responding to that. Like you could tell she was in shock. Drawers have been dumped out, papers are scattered, clothes are strewn across the floor, and drug dog mucus coats their belongings. The 2 men closest to them, Santiago and his son Santiaguito, are now detained. And there's obviously a lot to take away from the story and from the recounting of the raid, but there's a few things in the story that kept repeating themselves to me, right? So you look at some of the words. We were ordered to the carpet, to the carpet. I tripped over the children's toys. My daughter was in the cradle. They didn't have jackets. I was changing the baby. Um, this happened on just any given day of the year. Everybody was going about their life just in the way one goes about their life, changing babies, preparing food. Um, we often like to think of immigration enforcement as focusing on these particular individuals who are super dangerous, right, or engaged in this particular type of crimes. Um, but this is often just the day-to-day life, many of our day-to-day lives in the county in which we live, that this happened. So, like I said, I think of this, I want to give you a framing for how to think about this work. So if we're thinking about how to organize the impacts of this raid, how would we do it? And I think individual is probably the easiest. It's intuitive to wrap your head around, but nonetheless, it bears repeating that these type of traumatic events have all kinds of health repercussions. We know this. We know about PTSD and depression and all kinds of gastrointestinal heart issues that extend from this kind of trauma. It's not hard to imagine that many of the people who were in the room experienced these nightmares and traumatic effects for many months, if not years, to follow. So we see this immediate impact on those individuals. But then we also see how this changes the dynamics of family. Again, I feel like this is intuitive. When one of our family members is experiencing trauma, is going through something like this impacts our relationship with that person. And for the children who were connected to the women in this house or to the individuals who were detained, we see and we can understand the impact that this will have on the children, fearing every time that their parents leave the house, they may not see them when they return. I want to share one story. So Fernanda was the woman who was in the house, and she had a child who was, I believe, 3 months old. And I share this story about how the raid impacted Fernanda's ability to breastfeed her children, because it ends up being a very stark example of the way that immigration enforcement directly impacts the biological and physiological functioning of your body, and then the way that this directly impacts our relationship to, in this case, her infant. Fernanda directly attributed the changes in her body to the trauma she experienced when her apartment was raided. 22 years old at the time of the raid, Fernanda had 2 children, Lena, who was 1.5 years, and Ignacio, who was 3 months. In her interviews, Fernanda spoke at length about her own reaction to the raid, but also discussed ways in which the impacts on her directly affected her relationship with her son. I asked her, "How did your kids react the night the raid occurred?" And Fernanda said, "Well, the truth was, it was very horrible. My 3-month-old, I would try to nurse him, and me with this fright," she used the word, with this susto, so elevated, right, he went all night without nursing. So to be clear, the night of the raid was the last night that Ignacio ever nursed. He tried to nurse, and Fernanda tried to nurse him, but that Thursday in November marked the end of Fernanda's role as a breastfeeding mother. So when I heard this story, I knew immediately that what Fernanda has shared, this susto that marked the last day her infant ever consumed the leche produced by her body, thank you, was analytically important and symbolically meaningful. Susto has a rich anthropological history, interpreted often in Latino communities as a fright so serious the soul leaves the body. Thus, in Fernanda's narrative, she used the concept of susto to link bodily health to an act of 21st century immigration enforcement that scared the soul, or more specifically, the leche out of her body. Yet as a parent of young children at the time, those words, "Se la pasó toda la noche sin mamar pecho," knocked the wind out of me, leaving me unable and unwilling to draw out more of the story. I had watched my daughter nurse for 2 years, my son for over 2.5, and I had never considered breastfeeding to be part of their mother's citizen privilege. If breastfeeding and the connection between mother and child that it engenders can be severed by immigration enforcement, what is safe? What is sacred? Is there anything that immigration enforcement cannot spoil? 2 months later, Fernanda and I spoke again. You told me that Ignacio stopped nursing. Yes, she says, and I stopped giving him milk. I couldn't give him milk. My body just couldn't make it anymore. Because of the shock, the milk just left me. I couldn't make good milk for my son because of the susto. And then she says, ¿Cómo fue que entró el ice a la casa, verdad? She says, that's what happened when ice comes in your house, right? So over the course of this work, we've heard over and over and over from women who have lost the ability to breastfeed their children or who have miscarried and who attribute this to the immigration enforcement in their lives. And I think, research strongly shows, and I think, again, we believe we can understand intuitively that caring for a baby under this kind of stress will inevitably impact that relationship as well as the baby as child is developing. So I want to move a little bit back to you're collecting this data and you're putting the story together, and it's a story the community already knows, right? So it's tempting as researchers to come in and believe we're finding all these new things and that we need our theories and our language to make sense of the world. But people have been living these lives for their entire lives, for centuries. They know how to explain this to us, perhaps in different words. But so it's often tempting to feel like you're the one shaping the stories and to force them into a particular narrative instead of letting what people tell you go on to impact how you relay that information to your audience. And one of the things that happened to me is that, so this I share this story about leche, about, in this case, milk, in this case, breast milk. And this word kept appearing over and over and over, right? So people use leche in so many different ways. And I kept pausing, like, why does everybody keep saying this? What am I missing? I want to just show some examples where they've used it. Leche, milk, that word was repeated so many times by so many different people as they detailed the damage wrought by immigration enforcement on that Thursday in November of 2013. Guadalupe asked Santiago to pick up some leche for the hungry children, but Santiago was arrested on his way to get that leche and he never returned. Graciela, the organizer who sent out a mass text to warn the community about the rest on Huron Avenue, said that afterward, the fear of deportation hung so thickly in the air that no one left their homes. What if you needed milk? No, don't go get milk. You drink water. You make do with what you have because you're not leaving the house. Hilda, who watched as ICE shackled and detained her husband, shared that the 20 pounds he lost in detention was due to the pitiful meals he received. Oatmeal with water, no milk. From behind bars, Santiago lamented the fate of the family he could no longer support. What I earned for diapers, milk, food for the house. And Fernanda's ability to produce palatable breast milk to nourish her infant evaporated after she stared down the barrel of the officer's gun. Se me fue la leche, she told me. The milk just left me. So why was everybody saying this, right? Why did everybody keep drawing on that same word? And this is where I do, draw from some of our tenets of public health and think about our socio-ecological model, right? Our model about individuals, families, and communities, and how each of those is nested in the other. And what participants were telling me in not so many words, or perhaps in so academic terms, was to think about the multiple levels this is impacting us on. Think about how it changes our dynamics and our gender roles. You know, and gender roles was an interesting one that the word leche was used for, as wives would say, well, I could have been making him oatmeal with milk, but instead, when he was detained, they were making him oatmeal with water, right? Um, Analytically, that's quite rich. She feels as though she's failing in her role as the partner of this man who was now detained. Um, so this continued to push me, right, to think not to stick with the individual removed, but the community that he is a part of, and with the multiple rippling effects that we see from that single event. Um, I think as I mentioned, the individual and the family unit is intuitive to many of us. Sometimes the community level is a little bit harder to wrap our heads around. Um, but then with a few examples, I think it's intuitive. We can see and we can at least imagine um, what happens after a day-long act of immigration enforcement when everybody who was arrested coming out of that taller looked the same, right? And we know they were the same in at least two ways. So they were all men, and they were all Latino. Everybody who drove away from that place, who fit those two criteria, were arrested. And you could hear people talking about it in this way throughout the community. So Arturo was a man who was arrested as he drove away. And he spent like 5 hours in the car watching all these other arrests. And he said, I was one of the first that ICE picked up. Throughout like the next 5, 6 hours, I was in the ICE car chasing around other cars. And then the only purpose is if you're Hispanic, you will get pulled over that day, at that time. It was like a 5-mile range. So I asked him, so it wasn't even folks who were pulling out of that shop necessarily. It was anybody who was driving, and he interrupts me. Yes, anybody who was driving by. Like I said, the only request is if you are Hispanic, that's all you need. So as these text messages go out, there's this sense in the community that if you're Latino and you're a man, you stay away from that area, right? And so what does this do? What happens when we can't drive around our own community? Where can't we go? Again, we know from the literature that staying healthy and keeping our family healthy requires multiple different kinds of social support, right? We need information, we need people, there's places we go to celebrate, there's places we go to, there's gyms, grocery stores, and of course clinics. But when folks begin to be scared that because of their race they can't drive in this area, then folks don't go to these places they need to stay healthy. And what's more is that because of the interaction with ICE and the police, folks don't just fear ICE, but they also fear the police. And this is notable because in our county, unlike many southern border states and some northern border areas, we don't have ICE and Border Patrol driving around all the time. But we do have police, and police are on all of our roads. And when we fear that the police will racially profile us, we stop moving about our own community, and we stop going to the places that we need to stay happy and to stay healthy. So one of the biggest impacts here ended up being, right, so this fear of the police. I forgot, oh, 1 second. So one of the biggest impacts here ended up being this fear of the police, but often the fear of police didn't stop there, right? So sometimes it's easy to think of it like, ICE is this government service that deports me, and all these other government services, they do X, Y, Z, but they're unique and they're separate. But once you see ICE collaborating with the police, sometimes you don't really know where it stops. You don't know what information is going where. And so there are these further effects that, well, if ICE is going to collaborate with the police, are they also going to collaborate with clinics and schools? And where can I go? So I had the opportunity to talk to Guadalupe about this. And it was an interesting conversation because I was asking her, so, you know, after the raid, where do you go? Did you stop trusting everyone? Do you stop trusting just the police? And I hadn't really worked through it, and it was almost like she hadn't really worked through it either. Excuse me. So as I was asking her these questions, I could almost hear the wheels turning as she was trying to decide, well, what are the criteria here? When will I go get services? So I started by asking her about the police. The word for police that was frequently used is patrullas, which is like police cars. So you were talking about how frightened you were from las patrullas. Do you feel the same fear, for example, when you go to a clinic or a government office or something like that? And she replies, no. So I asked her, why not? She says, I don't know. Maybe it's because in clinics and such, I have received that help before the raid. For me, it's la policía. La policía are the ones who took the father of my daughters, the ones who took away my brother. They are the ones who took away my family, who, if they detained me, would separate me from my kids. So this itself is really analytically rich. So the police are not the people who are serving and protecting in these communities. They're the people who are taking people's fathers away. So Guadalupe seemed to say that she would continue to use social services because her fear of deportation stemmed from la policía, not social service agencies. This was important. But did the fact that Guadalupe continued to access services after the raid have to do with which services it was? Maybe it had to do with the timing. Would she access resources that she had already used but not new ones? I was curious, so I followed up. So after the raid, you used the same services you did before? And she says, yes. I asked when I went to renew my Wash Now Health Plan insurance, which is a health plan here accessible to undocumented folks, if there would be any problems, because ICE had my name and all that. But they told me no, not to worry. So I asked her, so you trusted the person who discussed this with you? She said, well, yes, because I thought that they know more about this than I do. She told me that all the information was confidential, and that if I wanted anyone to know something, I had to sign to authorize it first. So this distinction made sense to me, right? And again, I think it was analytically important, and I was thinking, so to return to the text, Guadalupe trusted those with whom she had previously worked, who were themselves aware of regulations related to sharing immigration status. Research has shown that interventions that are culturally and linguistically tailored to Spanish-speaking communities tend to be more successful than interventions that don't. So perhaps the finding that was additionally added was folks trust organizations who are also careful with their personal data. So I assumed that was the end of the exchange. But after a pause, Guadalupe refined her answer, catching me off guard. She says, the truth is, in that moment when they told me that my name would remain confidential, I thought it was a lie, and I was scared. I had Diane's address, so Diane is the mother of a white U.S. citizen, so that my bills could go there. I didn't want to give my address where I was, nothing. So I asked her, immediately after the raid, you didn't want to share your address, not with the Wash Now Health Plan, not with anyone. And she says, no, nothing like that. I didn't want to share this information with anyone, including food stamps for the kids. I didn't want to renew anything because I was so scared of everything. And, I appreciated her willingness to share that with me, but also her willingness to kind of think through it with me. And each iteration of that question, she gave me more information that made sense, right? So yeah, I trusted people I trusted before. That makes sense. And then yeah, I trusted people as long as they were careful with my information, which also made sense. But then at the end, she just said, no, I didn't trust anyone, right? I didn't trust anybody. And then she goes on to emphasize, not even food stamps for my kids. So when we think about the multiple levels of impacts, one in which I touch on much there, but I haven't touched on much today, is just the poverty of having a primary breadwinner removed. And that poverty led many of these families and leads families to be hungry because they don't have the income for food. This was a different example, and as I showed you with Leche repeating the theme over and over on different levels, food did the same thing. So we have infants hungry and couldn't eat. And then we have children and families who couldn't eat because the provider was removed and the income is gone. And then finally, we have children and families who couldn't eat because their mothers wouldn't use the government services to which they were entitled. So want to end reading one more part that, again, I discuss extensively in the book, and I'll just do briefly here, but I want to leave you with this question before I read it. Like, if we know that this kind of militarized enforcement can do this much damage across so many levels, how do we do it? So how do we, as a country, keep justifying it and keep justifying it? Not only justify it, how do we make it a fundamental part of our political platforms and then get elected for it? So throughout this work, people continually pushed to say, no, that wasn't an immigration raid. That was a drug raid, right? And then they love to push, no, that wasn't a drug raid. That was an immigration raid. But the fact that it was a drug raid, my initial reaction is like, whoa, this is really going to complicate the story. I'm not proud of it, but I definitely thought this would be a much easier project if it was just an immigration raid, right? But it wasn't. There were drugs involved, and hence there was a SWAT team involved and a different kind of warrant involved. But what I ended up seeing is drugs are used to justify violence across all types of communities and have been used for decades, if not longer. So part of what happened when I was doing this work is, so I did that. This raid happened in 2013. I started doing the work about 2014 and 2015. There was a lot going on in 2015 related specifically to police violence. So if we think back to who was killed in 2014, we remember it was Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, and many of at this time it was mostly Black men and Black boys were killed. And this is during, this is when the Black Lives Matter movement was growing. So what I did as part of the work, I was writing in police cars to see how police talked about immigration enforcement, right? So we know, again, ICE and Border Patrol are not driving around our communities, yet people end up deported, right? So who's doing it? We know it's the police, but police didn't really think it was the police. They thought it was somebody else. But they didn't really want to talk to me about immigration enforcement. They wanted to talk to me about the killing of Black men and women. And at this time, again, it was mostly Black men. So they kept talking about it, and they kept saying it, and they kept talking about what they thought about the media and what they thought about people who were filming it and how hard it was to be a cop. And they just thought, they just like, here's a Latino guy who wants to know about immigration. We can talk about police violence in the Black community, and he won't be able to pull anything out of this, which really gave me pause as I was trying to figure out, like, what does this whole bigger story mean? But there were so many similarities between the way they talked about and justified the killing of Black people and the way that we talked about and justified the deportation of Latinos in this community. So what I want to end with is that drugs ended up being an essential part of this narrative. And as I talk more about this to different audiences, I also know some people are really interested in the drug piece and just kind of taking the drug piece as this yes or no part, right? Was there drugs or was there not? Without thinking about the whole history of how drugs are used, and that we only have to suggest there's drugs in order to be able to justify this much violence. And as I read through and looked more at the death of Black men who were killed during this time, I realized how much drugs were used to justify those killings even after they happened. The vilification of drugs and drug users established during the war on drugs appeared numerous times to retroactively justify the killings of Black men during the Black Lives Matter movement. For example, when Philando Castillo bled out in front of his girlfriend and her child, the officer who fired 5 shots into his body at point-blank range justified his fear of Philando by referencing his marijuana use. As Officer Yanez shared in his testimony, if he has the guts and audacity to smoke marijuana in front of this 5-year-old and risk her lungs and risk her life, by giving her secondhand smoke and the front seat passenger doing the same thing, then what care does he have about me? When Reserve Deputy Robert Charles Bates shot Eric Harris from a few feet away, drawing his gun instead of his taser as Harris ran by, the defense attorney argued that the cause of Harris' death was not the bullet that pierced his right lung, but heart disease, meth use, and exertion. Bates, who was carrying a gun restricted by the department, who was not adequately trained to pull his taser and pulled his gun instead, was not what killed Eric Harris. That is, even though Harris was running from the police and shot by the police, his heart failed because of meth use. In November of 2013, Ora Rosser, a Black woman, was shot and killed by white Ann Arbor Police Department officer David Reed. Ora's boyfriend called the police to separate them during a domestic dispute. Officers entered their apartment, and when Ora turned and approached Reed and a second officer with a 4-inch knife, she was shot by Reed and tased by the second officer. After the Washtenaw County prosecutor decided not to charge Reed, protesters marched downtown Ann Arbor. Some of you who are here probably remember this happening. 2 bottles of medication used to treat bipolar disorder were found still full in Rosser's home, and an autopsy later revealed cocaine in her bloodstream. Summarizing the event, the mayor of Ann Arbor stated, "The events of that night, of course, were a tragedy, but not a tragedy of racism. The events of November 9th were a tragedy of mental illness untreated and drug use unabated." When Michael Brown was killed, Fox News commentator Jim Pinkerton said, "Eyewitnesses said that Brown was charging the cops. We'll know more with the blood test. If he was high on some drug like PCP, it's entirely possible you could take a lot more than 6 bullets and keep charging." The reference to PCP, or angel dust, as the creator of a superhuman black monster able to sustain bullets, echoed the police beating of Rodney King in 1991, in which Sergeant Kuhn testified, "In my mind, he exhibited this Hulk-like strength, which I had come to associate with PCP. Yet neither Brown nor King had any PCP in their systems when they were shot and beaten. The officer's suspicion that they might be using it was enough to justify the violence." So what we saw here, what I see here is these through lines between the police violence and killing of Black men and women and the justification of immigration enforcement. We create this villain, often using our war on drugs rhetoric, not convincing them, not convicting them with evidence, but merely suggesting that the drugs are present and suggesting that the presence of these drugs creates some type of monster that we have to unleash this violence to control. So I guess if I wanted to summarize with a few takeaways, the message that I want to leave you with today is that immigration enforcement impacts communities like ours, communities in the heartland of the US, as individuals, as families, and as communities, and even across communities, with different types of state violence, be it ICE or the police, impacting different communities of color, and often using drug language or this vilification to justify that violence. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to take a few questions. That was fast.
Thank you. And thank you to the students. I appreciated what you shared. So I'm so glad that you drew the connection between mass incarceration. I mean, some of that thread was there, as well as mass deportation, because essentially, if I'd closed my eyes and I didn't read the description of this event, as you started with the first excerpt from your book, I would have thought it was the same thing. just the terror and the trauma. And that's all I'm thinking of is the terror and the trauma that groups of individuals are experiencing together, and that collective trauma, so much so that a woman's breast milk dissipates. So as I'm thinking about that, I wanted to know about you, and I also wanted to appreciate, and I'll get to my question, that you said the stories have already been there, and they've been there for decades and sometimes centuries because of the intergenerational thread. I appreciated you going in, wanting to learn and not wanting to insert yourself into a situation. So what do you do, Bill, to self-care? Because you too were experiencing some of the trauma. It wasn't you, but you as a researcher, as a human being, were experiencing the trauma as you were bearing witness to what has taken place.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to comment on your first point first. Part of what happens is that people want a really simple story here, and this happens with all this type of work, right? So people want to know that immigration agents raided a building and they shouldn't have done that, and it was super violent, and tell me how rare this is, and tell me how bad and evil they are, right? And so many of those assumptions are wrong. Like what I'm not doing, I'm not commenting on a rare event. I'm commenting on a fundamental part of our system. Like you compared it to mass incarceration, the mass deportation system. Nothing I'm describing is unique. Like what I'm describing is actually far smaller than what we returned to after the current election. So people's desire for this to, I feel like it's this, I want to absolve myself of responsibility and hear about this super traumatic event, and that's not it. This is the way that our government functions. If we were to think about how would our government create an exploitable population that we didn't have to pay minimum wage to, that we didn't have to insure, and would go back to their home countries if they were sick, then we just have to threaten to separate their families, right? This is how the system functions. This is how we create a pool of labor, and we're benefiting from that labor, and it's our responsibility to do something about it. The other points that I like to make is folks want this to be about immigration and not about policing, because this happens far more in Black communities than it does in the Latino communities. Like the whole story about, so I describe it in detail here because it's a lot of numbers and a lot of or in the book, it's a lot of numbers and it's a lot of financial information. But basically the war on drugs put all this money into SWAT teams, right? So like, what do we do with our money? These police forces asked. We'll invest in SWAT teams. Well, what do we do with these SWAT teams? Well, let's just go look for drugs, right? So they just fabricated this drug problem. They just started saying, well, we have all these weapons. Let's go look in these houses. And it happened mostly in the African-American community. And we see how ICE and the police are sometimes working together, and this is happening in Black and brown communities. But it's certainly not the story of one racial group. It's the story of different sides of state violence happening in different ways. And part of the way this happens is splitting us up and thinking ICE violence is here and police violence is here, and they're different. And I saw that when police would tell me their stories about shooting Black people, thinking that I wouldn't understand the comparisons between immigration enforcement. The second question about self-care is a good one, and one that I appreciate. It's interesting doing this work. We combine our research and our advocacy. It's interesting doing the work of both because they require you to work at vastly different paces. And one thing that I learned is that if I'm gonna do this work as both, I'm a terribly slow academic because it takes a long time to do it. It takes a long time to go through the interviews. It takes a long time to, like this, what I'm doing right now, took me hours of not doing work this morning because I knew it was gonna be intense right now and emotionally draining, and I'm gonna go home and I'm probably not gonna get the work done that I'm supposed to do today because I'm gonna be exhausted. So it just takes a lot more time. The second thing is it certainly takes a village, and I have a great village of students who are supporting the work. A partner who, when I got here late, parked the car for me, thanks. And many people who have supported the work. And then the last point is I certainly am a person of privilege. I think when you are working, sometimes when there's a community of color, the white community or research community and a community with whom we're doing research, folks like to pretend those are just distinct. So like, oh yeah, that's a Latino community, right? And for folks in those communities, we know how many different subcategories there are, right? And a lot of times those fall along lines of privilege. So I try to always keep in the forefront of my mind, I'm working with undocumented Latina mothers. We're the same in that perhaps our racial ethnic category is the same, and we're parents, and we share in many of the same, we are part of the same community, but I have the privilege of being highly, if not overly educated, and being a man and being a citizen, right? So I feel like at times I step back to take care of myself, but ultimately I'm pushed forward knowing that they won't be listened to for multiple reasons that don't apply to me. So I, continue to keep doing the work. Public health question.
Hi, Bill. You talked about individuals kind of having fear around seeking maybe services or treatment that they needed after the raid and kind of having fear around who to trust. And so that made me think a lot about, like, in public health, how can we ensure that people are able to continue treatment seeking, help seeking? How do we facilitate that better? Is it having representation in those spaces so people feel like they can trust who they're talking to? Or did you see any themes come out among individuals who maybe were able to continue help seeking, and what facilitated that?
Yeah, so it's a great question that I want to answer in a couple of ways. So one is we can often choose this continuum of where to intervene, with the most immediate being intervening in kind of in the clinic or the face-to-face setting, and the most upstream or structural being, let's dismantle this particular system, right? So I always like to start at a little bit of the more extreme. Like if we want people to be comfortable seeking face-to-face care, perhaps we can't have their removal be an express part of our government system, right? So often it's like, what are the logical ways? Why would anybody feel comfortable when our president was elected to remove them and is pushing policies so that they don't get that care, right? So I'm always well aware that if I want to make this comfortable for individuals, is it possible? Is it wise? Does their hesitancy come from a much more informed place than mine does? That being said, I think on the other end, we are in public health, and I think it is our job to facilitate these interactions. So a lot of it is certainly education. Like, there's a climate of fear that we can combat with specificity, like these are the actual rules, and here's how we enforce them. I shouldn't use the word enforce. Here's the actual rules in our clinic. Here's what we do, right? An easy one is not asking for driver's licenses when you just mean any photo ID. Asking for a driver's license tends to out folks as undocumented in our state because they cannot get driver's license, as well as outing any folks who can't access driver's license. So that's one. And then language and other cultural markers in these spaces, I think, make folks feel more welcome. And then I think a third is bringing these services to people. So part of the issue is that you can have as welcoming a space as you want, but when people don't use their own roads, they're not going to get to them, right? So when ICE and the police become enforcers, we can't move about our community, we can't access the healthcare hubs we create, then we can often bring resources out to them. I wanted to also introduce my project manager, Noor. I'm going to let her introduce herself, and I'm also going to invite her, if you want to weigh in on any of this, you're more than welcome to. Can she use that one?
Hi, everyone. My name is Noor. I'm a senior in the School of Public Health. So I definitely was very interested in the intersection of this enforcement when we think about health access and services. But I also think it was really important for me as a student to really recognize the undertones of health that police activity really give to communities, right? And so it wasn't no longer looking at just the individual that was revolved or detained, but the families that were also impacted. And I think that from the local community organizations that we worked with, when we talked about services, driving was a huge thing that was a constant theme. You know, people are afraid to be driving. Visibility is a fear after these events occur. And so keeping that in mind when we are creating interventions, that visibility to go to health services, to take your children to school, these all become things that the community has to think about, that are everyday activities that we often do take for granted, but they have to think about this so clearly before they make a move because out of this fear, because they're so afraid of being visible. And I think when we did conduct our field work, you know, we went into this community and we really did not see the community until we went to a Spanish Mass. We went to church on a Sunday, and that's really when the community came out. As a Muslim, I've never been to church, so that was an important experience for me. But it is also very powerful to see how the community comes together and supports one another, and that although there's organizations that support, the community also lifts itself up with its strength as well.
Other questions? Sure. Here, you can use this other lapel.
Okay, I'm going to connect a couple different things that you mentioned. I wanted to ask, when you started doing this research, if you thought about how you had to make these stories feel real to everyone else who was reading, because I think a lot of times you mentioned drugs and how when drugs are put into the situation, if it's like, oh, well, they had drugs, the public is like, oh, well, then it's okay. And so I think that by talking about the milk and that whole dialogue is really important, because it maybe intentionally or unintentionally made these people feel like real individuals, like they could connect with them, because I think we're all taught and raised that like milk makes you strong, right? We need milk to survive. And these people are saying like, I can't feed my babies because this experience has caused so much stress that I can no longer produce milk. A lot of women can maybe relate to that, or just the fact that someone is malnourished because while in the detention centers, they are being made oatmeal with water. So I think it was just really important, and it really struck me that the way that the message was delivered, it was not in a way that dehumanized these individuals. I think it's very important that when we talk about these stories and write, incredible books like the one that you did, that we allow other people to see that, these people are individuals and that they're not merely trying to survive, but also thrive in this world. So I appreciated that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so I did. Sometimes when I'm talking about it, it seems like I had a lot more foresight than I actually did. A lot of this was, people shared these stories with me, and I just wanted to do them justice, right? So, given the choice between the academic article and a much more demanding thing that probably wasn't going to get me a career promotion, I chose the book format because I wanted their stories and their lives to have a little bit of room to breathe. And I had decided that even if it never gets read, like I owed it to them to put that into words that did them justice. At the same time, I understood that, I think stories can change hearts, and I think quantitative data can change policy, and I had the opportunity to do both. And I didn't want to miss doing both. So I did. And then another thing that I'll share with this crowd, because I trust this group, but I get so tired of having to convince people of their humanity, right? It's just and that's why it's like, I promise you these are people. I promise you they share some of your values and goals just like you, person who's never understood this life. And it's totally exhausting. And like I said, I think it's kind of part of the role and part of the privilege that I have is to, white knuckle, come into audiences that need to be convinced of my family's humanity and tolerate it for as long as I can to hopefully make it a little bit better, but it's absolutely fatiguing. Yeah. It was kind of a book-specific question, but if you want to add anything to it?
I think as somebody who's recently started with interviewing, it's hard to not want to use that qualitative work that we do because it is so different from normal research. And I think the approach of using the narrative and the story, a lot of the times in the book you are reading quotes, and I think it makes it a lot more powerful, and it's like, I don't know how to word it, but it's like sharing their story and letting people know. Oh, you. No, you're okay. Yeah, I definitely agree. And sharing the narrative is so powerful. And kind of going back to the privilege that we have as people who are citizens is, yeah.
Yeah, and I think privilege as researchers too, it's one that we often can forget. And, you know, I'll speak for my public health folks, but I think in social work it's the same. People trust us with their most vulnerable stories at their biggest moments of weakness. What we do in our job is fundamentally about death and is fundamentally about illness, right? And when people share those stories with us, I often feel like we owe it to them to bring it to a larger audience, not just an academic audience. And yeah, I mean, I think it's important to take that role as the bearer of stories seriously, but I also think as researchers, we're the organizers of stories. So we've collected a lot. I don't want to tell you just one. I want to tell you what all of these stories mean for the world that you live in, right? And I think that's what our research training primarily adds to the storytelling that we do.
I think this is our last question.
Thank you. I'm really excited to read your book. My family is from Colombia, Puerto Rico, and Europe, and I'm wondering if you had the opportunity to disaggregate at all by territory or nation of heritage.
Mm-hmm. No, in this case, I didn't. So the primary focus was on, right, a Latino community that was in Washtenaw County, and I would say most of it was Mexican and Central American, and I didn't look as closely as that. Can we take one more since that was a 30-second answer question?
Thank you so much for a really informative talk. My question is, where do you see, based on what you've done and your knowledge of this field, where do you see kind of it going, like the ICE deportation methods? Is this sort of, where do you see it going? Is it going to continue in this manner? Is there more controls on the enforcement, anything like that?
It's a good question. I think a lot will actually depend on the results of the election. Briefly, in 2008, there was an enormous worksite raid in Postville, Iowa, in which 300 people were removed. We didn't do that through all of Obama's tenure and through the end of Bush's tenure because both sides of the political party said this was a horrible way to enforce immigration law. We've returned to it in 2016, 2018, in Trump's immigration enforcement plan, right? So we're seeing these large worksite raids. A lot of our work is seeing how folks respond to that. And I think we're going to reach a critical mass where if it's not politicians decrying it, I hope it's the public decrying it. And I actually think like we're building on our language and our tactics against prison, so abolitionist movements, as well as the Black Lives Matter movements, looking at these movements across racial identities, again as violence conducted by the state, targeting minority, marginalized populations. And I think to the extent that we can combine those movements, it will end up being beneficial to highlight what's happening. Do you want to add anything?
On the more personal, interpersonal level, I think continuing to have these conversations and even having a space like this to where, you know, we're reading a book about immigration, we're talking about it, we're connecting it back to the things that are currently happening in our communities and are in our backyard, as we've stated, is a step forward for us all, I think.
Thank you very much for having us. And can we thank Nor, Madeline, and Lupe, and Isa?